Sometimes we need that reminder. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Thank you, Gary, for that prayer. Thank you for all of you who pray for your pastors. I'm one of those pastors that needs your prayers, so I appreciate that. This has been one of those weeks where I relied on your prayers. It's not been the best week. Friday morning, we buried little Landon Tyler, who never got to see the light of day. His life is very short in the womb. There's also new tension in our congregation, which for me as a pastor, that's a stressful thing. And then I come to this text that I'm preaching today, and how many of you done your homework and read the text? Not a lot of you, but if anybody did and said felt like they should like to preach this sermon, you're welcome. We can trade places. First time I read this text, I was like panic. I mean, it's one thing to read the text, but another thing to try to preach the text. What am I going to do with this? I mean, there's a lot of interesting things in this text. I don't know what you're having for dinner today, but it says in chapter 23, verse 19, the second part of that, it says, "Thou shalt not boil a young goat in his mother's milk." If you were planning to have goat for lunch, you might want to rethink how you're preparing that. I don't know exactly what that's about. The closest thing I could comment to is from commentaries that that's about a pagan practice back in Egypt, and God was saying, you're different than those people. But, as I looked at this, I was thinking, well, why not one of these young pastors with the fresher and better minds and better understanding of culture? Why aren't they the guys preaching this? But God has ways sometimes that are different than I understand. And so here we are today with this text. And it's a long text, chapter 21 through 24. There are some books of the Bible that are shorter than the text that I have this morning. And I thought, you know what, I could just read the whole way through this thing, and by the time I'd be done, it would be time to say amen, and we could go home. The more I interacted with the text, the more comfortable I became with it, and so I have some things to say out of this text this morning. I came to realize that God's heart is reflected in his laws to his people. And so I came up with a title this morning, God's Heart Revealed Through Law. And so that's the direction I'm going to approach this from. In the first reading of this text, without the background of the culture, without the understanding of what is implied when you read it, and many of you haven't, I take, but if you read it, it almost has that shock effect to it. And because we read it from our cultural perspective, and when we read it from our cultural perspective, some of the stuff in here almost sounds offensive to us. There's verses in this text here that you'll never find hand-painted on a wooden sign hanging on somebody's wall. Chapter 21, verse 7, for instance, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she should not go out as the male slaves do. Nobody's going to hang that on their wall. You're not going to find a coffee cup with that verse written on it. Or take for another one, for verse 28 in the same chapter, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and the flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. You'll not find that on a list of Bible memory verses. And it goes on and on through this text. You're getting a sampling of what this looks like if you haven't read it yet. But as I was reading this, I was thinking of somebody that was from our culture today who was not a Christian, who didn't understand the heart of God, and would sit down and read through these Bible verses. They'd open up the Bible, it falls open to Exodus 21, and they start reading. They read these 4 chapters. It would be enough for them to say, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this. So it's only when we understand the heart of God that when he's speaking and when he's giving rules, when he's giving laws, if we understand the context that he was speaking into and the heart of God, only through that do these things make sense to us. Before we become too critical, picture for a moment one of these people from back here, one of these Israelites would come into your house, sit down in your living room, turn on your TV, and a program comes on, which I have actually never watched, but there's 25 women living in one house fighting over the emotional affections of one man. You know, and that sounds crazy when we think about it, but think about if somebody didn't have any concept of that would come in and say, they would say, what is this about? Or if one of these Israelites would come and they would see on the news or on the internet or something that in the United States since 1973, over 62.5 million babies have been murdered. And we have laws that protect that. We have laws that protect the people that do that. We have laws that say it's okay for people to do that. They would say, what kind of crazy laws do you have? There's other weird laws that we have. Arizona, the state of Arizona, has a law in its books that says a donkey cannot sleep in a bathtub. I'd like to know the history of that. Arizona says it's illegal. No, Alabama says it's illegal to wrestle a bear. I mean, if the bear don't get you, the law is going to, so don't even go there. Michigan, if a wife cannot cut her hair without her husband's permission, a law that's on the books. Here's a good one. Memphis, Tennessee. A woman cannot drive a car without a man walking in front of her waving a red flag. Actually makes sense, doesn't it? Just kidding. None of these are enforced anymore, but they're laws that are on the books. And I say all this to point out that even in our culture, things have changed. We've shifted the place sometimes, somewhere along. Some of this must have made sense to somebody. Today, it no longer makes any sense to us. And so the culture or context that we look at this really makes a difference. And the thing here to remember about these verses is that the heart of God is demonstrated, the heart of God's love is demonstrated in all the laws that are in the Bible. Jared last Sunday preached about the 10 Commandments and made reference to, I think it was Matthew 22, when they came to Jesus and said, what's the greatest commandment? And he gave them 2. He said, is love God and love your neighbor. And that all the other laws, all the other commandments hang on those 2 laws. They're the 2 greatest commandments. And so everything that God writes about his laws hangs on those 2 commandments. Love God and love people. And if you, when you read through this, you will understand that God's really caring about people when he does this, when he writes these laws. And many of the laws here are really designed to protect the most vulnerable people in their society. That's why he wrote these. I'd like to begin by going back to chapter 24. And look at the response following all this, the writing of these laws. Chapter 24, verse 3 said, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the words the Lord have spoken, we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord down in chapter 7, or verse 7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it. This book of the covenant, these words Moses wrote down, these things that are recorded in the chapters ahead of us, before us here. Where am I at here? 7. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said again here, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words. And Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. And there under his feet was like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven of clearness, for clearness. And he did not lay hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and they drank. And so what we're seeing here is a very, very powerful moment, a very intimate moment, a very holy moment. And if there's nothing else that we get out of this sermon today, may it be that when God speaks and God's people say, I will obey, there's this intimacy that takes place between God and his people. And so let's hold that in our mind as we go through all this other things back here. And I've broke this down. There's so much stuff in here that we can't near cover all of it. So I have 7 things that I want to touch on this morning, and I'm calling the treatment of for each one of them. The treatment of slaves, the treatment of parents, treatment of property, treatment of leaders, treatment of enemies, treatment of foreigners, and treatment of resources. Now that sounds like a lot. Some of these, especially the first one, we're going to spend a little time waiting around, but some of them we're going to just kind of breeze past, and you'll get the message very clearly on them without me having to really say much at all. But back in chapter 21, verse 1, now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and on the 7th year he shall go free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, and then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him his wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, then his wife and his children shall be. Then his wife and his children shall be her masters, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, and I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and they shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Now when you read that, it says, man, what's this all about? And coming from our cultural history, you know, it's what do we do with this? You know, faced with the current hot topics that are around our country right now with racism and all that stuff, it's like, how do you handle stuff like this? This verse is in some way feel like a hand grenade that the pin's been pulled, and here it is, it's going to explode at any minute. But I think we need to first start by being honest. People in the past have used verses like this and twisted them and used them out of context to do some very sinful things of oppressing people and putting people under servanthood that should never have happened. People that were created by God for his glory have been put in situations that was wrong, sinful. And so we need to be honest and open about that right up front. There's no question that enslavement of a person unwillingly is abuse. And we should be quick to acknowledge that. Not only that, the viewing of any race as inferior or superior is also wrong and sinful. God created all people. He views them all the same. And to view one race as higher or lower than another is also very, very wrong. So it's important for me to and important for you to very carefully examine our own attitudes, our own thoughts about others around us, that they come in alignment with God's view of people. Having said that, when we come to the culture and the context of these verses, God is giving rules about something here that's not like what was taking place in the 1800s in the United States. He's talking, this is something different than that. First of all, he says, this is not an oppression of another race. He says, verse 2, when you buy a Hebrew slave, this is people dealing with their own race, their own people, a Hebrew buying another Hebrew. And secondly, when we hear this word buy, it makes us recoil. But when he's talking about buying here, this is a contractual agreement. And we know this because he says here, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and the 7th year he shall go free for nothing. This is a contract that they're coming under here that the person, the slave and the master are both agreeing to. When a person had a debt, they would sometimes say, I'll come work for you. You provide me with the housing and food and clothing, and I'll give you my services, and we'll have this arranged, whatever that contract would look like, and they would serve that out, and then they were free to go. Or a person would say, I need income. I'll come work for you. I'll be your slave, as it says, the word it uses here, and I'll serve for you, and you help take care of me. Matter of fact, we got something in our culture today that helps us understand this a little bit better. It would be professional sports. In the NFL, the word buying and selling shows up all the time. They buy a player, they sell a player, they release a player. They give them free agency. It's the same kind of wording. And when they buy a player, they're not buying the person, they're buying his services or her services, and they can't go play for another team. They are under contract with that team. And so it's a similar thing back here. This person became under contract with the master to, this is what I'm going to do for you, and this is what you need to do for me. The Israelites were coming out of slavery themselves. 400 years of a culture of slavery which was a sinful kind of slavery, the oppressive slavery, an abusive slavery. And God said, when you come out of that, I'm going to give you some rules that you are not going to treat people like you were treated. I'm going to set up some guidelines so that you treat people differently than you were treated. And he says here, this is a contract, the maximum contract could be 6 years, and they were set free. And he said, matter of fact, if you decided this worked out so well for you that you don't want to end the contract, you can go back to your master and say, no, I like what's going on here. This is working out for me, and I want to stay with you. Verse 7, the one we read earlier, different rules for a female slave. He says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He said the roles are different here, and when it says designated for himself, that means that this was somebody to become his bride. It was an arranged marriage, and as crazy as that sounds, their marriages were all arranged. This was nothing different than any of the other daughters would have had. And when a father's responsibility was to get the best arrangement for his daughter that he could get, and sometimes that involved trying to get them in a better setting. You know, my daughter will work for you, serve you, and then to get this relationship, get this marriage. It was a contractual thing. And if it didn't work out, then she wasn't under compulsion to stay. She could be redeemed. And then it goes on, he shall have no right to sell her to the foreign people. There were rules that they couldn't have their oppressive kind of control over he couldn't it wasn't his property. He couldn't take her and sell her to somebody else. There was a contract that had to be honored by both sides. It says, since he had broken faith with her, he was responsible for his end of the contract. If he designated her for his son, or for a wife for his son, he shall deal her as with a daughter. If he has this arrangement, then she becomes like one of his very own daughters, the same rights as a daughter. And if he takes another wife to himself, this son, and which was actually a cultural thing, they did that back then too, it was before God set those rules in place. He says if that happens, she has rights. He shall not diminish her food or clothing or her marital status. For if he does these three things for her, then if he does not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. So we understand it's a contractual thing. Either side could break it and it would nullify this situation. And so what we see here and read here is first is that shock impact. We need to understand in the context of God, I care about these people. I'm going to make sure they're taken care of. Second point here, treatment of parents or treatment of family. Chapter 21, verse 15. Whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Verse 17, whoever curses his father or mother shall be put to death. I'm glad we're not under Old Testament law today. Some of us in this room might have been guilty of some of those things. But young people and children, this emphasizes the point that God cares very, very much about how you relate to your parents, how you treat your parents. The fourth commandment was honor your father and mother. This is how that's fleshed out. How do you honor? You respect them. You treat them. You cannot be abusive in any way toward your parents. Treatment of parents, treatment of family talks about life in the womb here in chapter 21, verse 22. He says, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, that means that there's this alteration and this woman somehow gets hit and it causes her baby to be born. But there is no harm. That means that the mother or the child, they're okay. The one who hit her shall surely be fined. There's still consequences. If the woman's husband, as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. If this happens, the husband said, this is what your responsibility is, that you need to pay for this, and the judges say, okay, yay or nay, and they figure that out. So there's consequences. It goes on. But if there's harm, in other words, if the baby is not alive, he says, then you shall pay life for life. eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. He says, this baby in the womb should be treated with the same kind of laws that a born person. God is giving honor to the baby in the womb. God is elevating the life of a baby in the womb to the same level as anybody else. And this is something that our culture today should really hear. He talks about the father and the fathers and the widows and the fatherless in chapter 22, verse 22. He says, you shall not mistreat the widow or the fatherless child. If you mistreat them, they will cry out to me, and I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and children, and your children fatherless. He said, these are again the vulnerable people. He said, these people need to be protected. And matter of fact, if you cause harm to them, the same harm you cause to them will be caused to you. Matter of fact, he said, even if you mistreat them. God, treatment of parents, treatment of family. Thirdly, treatment of property. Chapter 21, verse 33, it says, when a man opens a pit, or a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. He said, if you do something to cause your neighbor or somebody else to have harm, then you need to repay them. It goes to another level, verse 35. If a man's ox butts another man so that it dies, they shall sell the live ox and shall sell its price, and the dead beast shall be, they shall also share. And so there's this other level here that if your ox goes out and kills another ox unintentionally, you need to split the differences here. You know, he's bringing this responsibility to human relationships. Then it goes to another level, verse 36. And if it is known that your ox has been accustomed to goring in the past, and the owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. He said, if you knew better and you didn't take care to protect this, and this happens, then you need to completely replace that ox. And then it goes to another level in verse 1 of 22. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So God's setting up this accountability system here that when we are responsible, God's people are responsible for the harm that they do. Fourth, treatment of a leader, verse 28. You shall not rival God or curse a ruler of your people. God said there's special laws here, special rules here about the rulers of the people, and we need to always keep this in mind. We don't always maybe agree with our rulers, our leaders, but we got to be very, very careful what we say and our attitudes toward our leaders. The fifth one, the treatment of our enemies, verse 23, chapter 23, verse 4. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, then you should shoe him so he runs even further. No, he says, then you shall bring it back to him. If it's your enemy's ox and you see him, you would hope the worst, but he said, no, you need to go get that animal and bring it back to your enemy. Verse 5, if you see a donkey of the one who hates you lying down under its burden, you should say, that's what you deserve, good for you. No, he says, you shall refrain from doing what you want to do, refrain from leaving him with it, and shall rescue it with him. This is the man who hates you, your enemy. Treatment of foreigners, chapter 23, verse 9. You shall not oppress a sojourner, for you know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. He said, you understand what it's like to be in a foreigner. You understand that you should not oppress them. You need to respect them. Same thing over in verse 21 of the chapter before. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. This is a hot topic today in our country. Immigration. I wish I had the wisdom to know what should be done with that. I mean, country does need borders. But when I read the plights of some of these people trying to come here, many of them are brothers and sisters in Christ. And my heart goes out to these people. My heart goes out to my brothers and sisters who are under oppression and looking for something to alleviate that. And I wish I knew what an answer is. I do not know what the answer is in this situation, but I do know that God says we are not supposed to oppress the foreigners, the sojourners, and so our heart needs to continue to be open to those people around us. You know, racism is going a lot of different directions and a lot of different people nowadays, and we need to check our spirits in those areas. And finally, number 7, the treatment of resources. Chapter 23, verse 19, he says, the best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. The best of your resources, God says, those make sure you understand they're from me. He set up these 3 feasts right before this, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He said, I want you to remember where you came from. Then he sets up the Feast of the Harvest, the first fruits, that when your crops produce, you know, those first big, juicy red strawberries, the ones we want to buy are the first ones that come out, God says to them, that's what you give to me. This helps you remember where they came from, that they're only there because I've given you the ability to grow them. I've called them to grow. And then it's also the third feast, the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the season when they brought all their crops. And again, God said, remember why you have what you have. Remember the blessings that I've given you. Treatment of our resources. Time is our resource. Back in verse 12, it says, 6 days you shall go to work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. And your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your slave woman and the alien may be refreshed. He said, this is a rest for everybody. We had a business that moved in beside our business in Turry Hill a number of years ago, and they weren't believers, and I'm not sure if they had any church background or not, but they would work 7 days a week. And I got to know them quite well and interact with them quite well, and eventually there's 2 guys, they both committed their lives to Christ and started going to church and getting involved in that, but they still came to work on Sunday. And I said to them, you know, you're not helping yourself by working on Sunday. That God has a principle in place here that this is my personal belief that you will benefit more by taking that day off than you will by working every day. Maybe that one day you make more money. In the long run, God's going to bless his principles. And they changed it. You know, credit to them. They changed how they do business. And actually, they're not there anymore. But And so, you know, God says even our time is a resource that we need to be in control of and be giving it to him. Well, what do we do with this? Justice is a word that's in the news every day in our world. Everything's about justice. And we live in a world where justice can mean so many different things. A text like this helps us have a reset. How does God see justice? God sees justice as us being responsible for our actions, intentional or unintentional. God says, if you cause damage, whether you intended it or not, you have a responsibility to execute justice. Unfortunately, our culture is teaching many people, and particularly our young people, I believe that responsibility does not really matter. If you're really upset about something and you do something that damages somebody else's property, that's okay. God says that's not okay. And God calls his people to a different level. So it should challenge us to right the wrongs that we've caused, whether it's a coworker, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's a family member, whether it's a brother or sister in the church, whether it's somebody we don't even know, a foreigner, a sojourner. They all deserve to be treated with justice. And if there's anything about our attitude that needs adjusted, whether it's to other races, whether it's to foreigners, whether it's to leaders, whether it's to parents, whatever they may be, may we bring that before God and confess that and make that right. Oh, may God bless the sharing of his word. Father God, we come to you this morning. I acknowledge to you, Lord, that this is a difficult text, but we know it is your word, it's your holy written word, and so help us to glean from your word those things that can help us to be the people you called us to be. Thank you for Christ and the coming of a new covenant, and that some of these things are not carried out the way they were back then, Lord, and so we're so grateful for that. Thank you for grace that you've given us. But we still see the context that they're shared and the principles behind them, and they're still applicable to our lives, Lord. So help us to be hearing. Help us to be understanding of those things that you would want us to know and to do and to exercise. Help us to be your people in this world that others can say there's something about them that's different. And I pray this prayer today in Jesus' name. Amen.